Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Baltimore for the Real News Network. We have been watching a lot of stuff based on this COVID-19 pandemic. What we haven't been looking at that much was how prisoners are being used to combat some of the effects of the pandemic. But beyond that, prisoners are being used to combat climate change. And one of the places we can get a good view of this is in California. California has been using prison labor to fight fires since World War II, in fact. But there's been cries from certain parts of the population to say that the program is slavery or indentured servitude, it should be cut out. There's a response from prisoners and prisoner supports to say this is a program that allows them to become rehabilitated and also advance themselves when they return back to society. But what I want to do today is look at this program, look at how prisoners see it, how people outside see it, and look at its history. So joining me to kind of like give us an overview is Brandon Smith and Augustine Beard. Now, Brandon Smith actually is the founder of the Firefighters recruitment program in California. Augustine Beard is a person that has studied this and has did an extensive research and wrote a paper on it. So Brandon and Augustine, thanks for joining me today. Let's start off first with you, Brandon. Tell us about this program in California. Give us a little background and tell us how it's impacted you. You were part of the program. So what's your organization doing? What is the program doing? And what's the difference between being in that program and being in a cell?
So I'm Brandon Smith. I am the co-founder and the director of FFRP. FFRP is the Forestry and Fire Recruitment Program. What we do is we go help the folks in California's fire camps transition into gainful employment once they come home. We do that in a couple of ways. We go to the fire camps and let the folks know who are incarcerated that there is a pathway for you to obtain this career once you come home. And we also help them out to apply for these careers and help them by providing transitional employment for the folks. So our main goal out here is to get folks who come home from fire camps and get them gainful employment within the sector because, sheer facts are that wildfires have been increasing in the Western United States for the past 50 to 100 years. I am so passionate about this is because I actually spent time in fire camp. I was in Batista Conservation Camp in Hemet, California for 2 years. I remember being in a cell when a counselor at the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, she came and knocked on my cell and said, "Hey, do you want to be a wildland firefighter? Do you want to go to fire camp?" And at first I said no. I had watched Backdraft as a child and was like, nah, firefighting isn't my thing. But when I talked to folks, I realized that the conditions and the situations, life would be so much better for me. I'd be out in the community. I'd eat better food. I wouldn't be within 4 concrete walls in a small window. I'd get an opportunity to go out and help folks. So, I'd get paid the most amount of money as anybody would being incarcerated. It was the highest paying job in there. So I decided to do it, and lo and behold, I loved it. I loved it so much. I tried to do it once I came home, and there was pretty much no pathway. I ended up finding one small pathway, and it was at that moment. It was actually my first fire, and I was on the fire professionally, but I looked and I saw the folks who I was previously incarcerated in fire camp with. And it was at that point where we decided to start FFRP so that we can share and expand on these pathways so that people do know there is a way. It's not easy and it's not for everybody, but for folks who want to do it, there is a way to transition over.
Okay, we'll get back to that in a minute. Augustine, you've done history on these camps. These camps been around since the first white settlers went to California, I understand. And these camps have been used in various different ways. Can you give us like an overview and a background of these camps and how they're being used today and how they were used 100 years ago?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Eddie. And it's really cool to hear about the work you're doing, Brandon. I'm a wildland firefighter too, so I've worked alongside in my careers. It's really cool to hear that stuff. I really admire everything you're doing. Yeah, so incarceration and incarcerated labor have a long history in California, dating back all the way to the conquest by the Spanish of indigenous peoples. In a lot of ways, the missions that they built resembled um, contemporary prisons by caging and incarcerating indigenous people and creating systems of forced labor. The first prison, the first U.S. prison in California was San Quentin Prison, and they built this in 1851. The California government built it in response to the perception of a crisis of idle populations, referring to migrant workers who had come over for gold extraction, and a crisis of underutilized natural resources. So the state saw both these problems and in attempt to create a solution, built a prison system that resembled sort of a convict police system in the post-Civil War South, where a private leasee could utilize the prison labor for natural resource extraction and processing. Almost immediately, they encountered another crisis. They believed that San Quentin lacked natural advantages necessary for a prison. This is their language, natural advantages. So they sought to reform and transform the system. The natural advantages that they believed that San Quentin lacked was inadequate access to natural resources, inadequate access to trade routes. It was kind of disconnected from other places in the Bay Area at the time. And they believed that the fog and topography facilitated escapes. So they set about finding a new location for a prison. And finally, in 1880, settled on Folsom State Prison. So they built Folsom State Prison as, as a ideal model of what a prison with natural advantages had. They believed it had access to granite and other natural resources like timber. It was close to the American River where they wanted to build a dam. It was close to agricultural land, so they believed incarcerated people could engage in farming. And it was close to other potential logging sites where they believed the timber could be processed at Folsom. So in this same time, in these same decades in the 19th century, a vision of prisons emerged, particularly out in eastern United States, of reform. So a reform movement emerged that focused on the religious and moral reform of incarcerated people in classrooms. And these two groups were really at odds. So the people who wanted a natural resource extraction from incarcerated people and the people who wanted the moral reform, they really butted heads. They didn't agree. The moral reform people thought that outdoor labor detracted from the moral transformation of incarcerated people. But at the end, in the 19th century, I argue, what I call the natural resource colony model of prisons emerged victorious. These moral reformers really didn't get a lot of the demands that they made, and they still constructed Folsom despite the contestations of the moral reformers. So in the 20th century, early 20th century, two really important developments emerged. So first of all, there was a huge boom in the prison population in California. It almost doubled in the 1920s. And they also found that they were having trouble transporting natural resources across the state. And at the same time, the reformers found a new lexicon or vocabulary to talk about reform that incorporated outdoor labor. And this is really borrowing from the early 20th century conservation movement. Think Teddy Roosevelt, John Muir, and these people who are all about going outdoors to like become more masculine and stuff. They really thought they took that language and applied it to the outdoor prison labor and natural resource extraction. And so what emerges in the early 20th century are these highway honor camps. So the highway honor camps, or the prison honor camps, they took incarcerated people and brought them to underdeveloped areas in California where natural resources were not adequately being extracted in the view of the state, and put them to work. So one of the main projects they did was build highways. The first highway connecting San Francisco to Northern California along the coast up to Eureka was built by incarcerated people. This is today Highway 101 or near it, to connect the timber industry up in Northern California to the markets and the ports in the Bay Area. So this new model of prison created this language of reform, created this language of rehabilitation to justify the natural resource extraction that was already occurring. Because we saw in the 19th century, they were going to do it anyways. So they developed this new language to justify that. And that's really the important development of the 19th and early 20th century.
So that leads me to another question for you, Brandon. I understand that, and I could be wrong, but you see this program as a program that might be similar to indentured servitude. Other people are saying it's probably closer to slavery. And I spent 15 years working as a graphic art designer in the sign shop in Maryland's prison, and I was making about $6.50. So I understand the money relationship when every other prisoner is making $1. But I also understood that I should have been making $25 an hour, $200 a day. And so in effect, even though it wasn't slavery because I volunteered to do it, it was in effect slavery in the sense that the state was saving a lot of money by using my labor. I did learn stuff and so on, and it was a skill that I could have used if I wanted to. But then, Brandon, what's the like you say, you wanted to get away from those four walls. You wanted to get away from eating that food that they serve you. You wanted to get away from making that dollar that they was giving you for working every day. And of course, you wanted to look forward into the future. But how does do prisoners understand that this is still it's a coercion, it's forced, it's there is a carrot, but the stick is the stick that they use on everybody else in the prison system. Explain to me, how you make the distinction between slavery and involuntary servitude, and beyond that, what's the demographics, of the program?
So, there's a lot of conversation, especially in the past couple of years, about is this work slavery or similar to slavery? And to me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And to me, I can't say that the experience that I have is the same as the one my enslaved ancestors had 300 years ago. And surely in the semantics of things, mainly in the fact of I made a choice. I made a decision. They did not force me to go to fire camp. They asked me if I wanted to go, and there wouldn't be any consequences to me saying no. But you are completely correct. Having the stick and dangling the carrot, because and in some instances I can see where I may have been coerced. It was the best job. I was making $1.40 a day. If I was on a fire, I was making $25 a day. I wouldn't do that if I was in prison, quote unquote, or within those four walls. Dishwashing and the highest paid jobs were maybe paying 20, 30, 40 cents an hour or a day. The food was 10 times better. And so one of the things one of my friends said is like, yeah, you made the choice, but it was like comparing, like, do you want to go sit in the dungeon or do you want to go be outside and go see the sun? Who is going to go make these, who is going to go say, I want to go sit and not do this all day? I want to sit in terrible conditions in four walls, doing nothing all day. So it's kind of like, yes, did they force my hand? Definitely. I look at this to be indentured servitude more or less because in indentured servitude in that system, what I see is there's this concept of where like we're helping these people out and we're providing them with the skill, But in indentured servitude, these folks are pretty much no better off than where they were where they started. Once they get out of it, is they really didn't gain much. And that's how I liken this experience to fire camp. It's like, you spend all this money giving me the same training, that Augustine got. We take the basic 40s and we take the first aid CPR and we do all of that stuff. And it costs a lot of money, but when I come home, I don't have the opportunity to use that skill or use that trade. And that's the challenge where I link this to indentured servitude. Because one of the things, lastly, Augustine is right. My work wasn't just as a wildland firefighter. I cleaned out, I cleaned water treatment plants. I did search and rescue. I did fuels reduction projects, fire prevention, felling trees. There was so many different skills, auto mechanics that we learned in there, and we didn't really have the opportunity to use them. So the state saves, I think it's over $1 billion a year, and there is no real compensation for these folks. They're heavily utilizing this labor, and it's a symptom across the country. And I think we as Americans should be ashamed about that, and there should be some way to better compensate or better prepare these folks coming home to utilize the tools that they use, especially if it's saving the state and the country billions and billions of dollars a year.
Okay, so Brandon, I was asking you about the demographics also of the program.
Yeah, definitely. So that's an interesting fact. And that is where I would argue or see one of the stronger ties to slavery. So honestly speaking, in wildland firefighting just in general as a career is primarily white men. And that's just what the system is. And it's also primarily based on like a family referral system. It's about who you know. So what you'll find in wildland firefighting or in firefighting in general is, being that the majority of people in that career are white men, what you'll see actually in California's fire camps is you'll actually see is majority African Americans, Black folks, Hispanics, Asian communities, and also women, because there are women camps. I don't have the specific figures because I don't believe the state publicizes them, but I'm sure Augustine can probably attest to this. The majority of non-white firefighters that you see on the fire line is specifically in California are people in California's fire camps that look like us. The majority of Black firefighters in California are people who are currently incarcerated. I would argue that the majority or even like 50% of the women in wildland firefighting in the state are women who are people who are incarcerated. So what you see in this system is heavily populated by minority communities that doesn't necessarily represent the workforce out there, which also does not represent the communities. It tends, the optics of this look very clear. You have 17 Black and Hispanic folks on a crew led by a white male overseer type person. The optics of that it can easily draw us back to that. So yeah, the majority of folks are white men, and in fire camp is majority Black.
That's interesting. When I came home from service, one of the things I did was help to integrate the fire department here in Maryland, in Sparrows Point. In fact, I was a firefighter for about 6 months. And it was 6 Blacks and 100 whites, pretty much. And every fire department I've seen had similar statistics. After all of this stuff, through the prison, through the fires, and you go home, I understand you managed to overcome the hurdles, but I understand most of the prison firefighters are not taken into the firefighting profession. Why is that, and how do you change that?
So facts. While I was in fire camp, I asked the correctional staff, I asked the fire officers, captains, and chiefs, like, how can I do this when I come home? And none of them had an answer for me. Everybody was basically like, good luck. and it was only by the grace of God, my support system. And actually, I got my first opportunity professionally from a Black woman. She was the fire chief of the fire department in Big Bear, and she was the one who decided to kind of ignore my past and give me an opportunity to go do the work. one of the biggest issues is just a lack of awareness. Nobody knows about the ways to hop into this sector. And so what we go do, the first thing we go do is we go inspire people. We go say, hey, I was in fire camp, I did it, so can you. One of the things, I wish I had somebody when I was incarcerated in camp who said, hey, this is actually possible. I was almost down and out. Folks, when they're in camp, we think of this as like when we come home, when we parole, this is going to be a story that we just tell our children or our grandchildren. Like, hey, I used to do that back in the day. You know, when a fire hops on TV, we don't believe that we can actually do it, because one challenge is we're dealing with reentry alone, which is a challenge in itself. And then there's also this very big contrast where we're going from being considered a public nuisance to a public safety officer. You know, it's like a 180-degree shift. So we have a lot to prove, and people are hesitant about that. And so you'll find a situation where systems where, for example, the majority of municipal and county fire departments won't even hire folks from fire camp because they have a sheer cap on, you know, any felonies, and you're just automatically disqualified. I'm not here to argue, you know, the legitimacy of that, right? Because firefighters are a cherished position, but in a space where there is a dire need for more wildland firefighters across the state, across the country, you know, and everybody is trying to figure out what to do. We have a population of people right here who deserve the opportunity to continue to go use these skills.
You said earlier when you was giving us a overview that these camps have been used in various ways. Also, I'm impressed. I didn't know these camps were used to build highways. It seems to me like they use these camps at any given period for whatever is the state needs in terms of free labor. Uh, how do you see dealing with that? I mean, because it's the carrot's always going to be tempting, um, and obviously the stick is always that prison system. How do you deal with building fair play in the camps?
As I understand, you're asking about the rehabilitation and reform aspects of these camps, and its history as primarily a method of labor extraction. So going back a little bit, it's what historians like to do. It's like, oh, I got to go way back to answer this question. So the modern camps that we see now emerged in World War II, and it was in response to a fear of sabotage by Japanese people and Japanese Americans. They thought they would go out and light the forests on fire, or they thought that the Japanese would come and firebomb the forests, and so they saw it as a military uh, uh, disadvantage. The lack of fire suppression during World War II, so they shifted these highway camps to be able to have the capacity for incarcerated people to fight fire as well. And that's the emergence of the modern camps today, was based on that fear. So by the 1960s, these camps grew immensely under the New Deal Democrats, who were in control of California at the time, to having thousands of incarcerated people. I think it was about 25% of incarcerated people in California were involved in these camps in the mid 1960s. And mostly with fire suppression and fuels reduction and fire prevention. Um, so what's interesting about this period is they did have a concept of rehabilitation and reform. They did have vocational trainings. They had narcotic treatment and all these sort of scientific ways of analyzing incarcerated people. That was kind of the model at the time. But when they talked about rehabilitation and vocational training, they never brought up the camps. So my research, what I did was I looked back at the state reports, so the reports of prison administrators to the state legislature, and they would have different sections. So they would be talking about the conservation camps and how great they were and stuff. And then they would have a section on rehabilitation and vocational training and job training, but didn't mention the camps. So they didn't really conceive of it in the same model. The way that they talked about the camps was still a holdover from the early 20th century, what I referred to earlier, where they had this sort of metaphysical idea of like how this was helping incarcerated people. Largely, they believed that it was turning making these men more masculine by going out and working in the woods. So they emasculated mostly men of color who were involved in these camps in that way. So if it wasn't about necessarily the rehabilitation thing, then what was it about? I think there's really two key ideological components here, two key components here. I think there's a important aspect of the politics of fear operating. So this goes back to what I was talking about with World War II and the fear of Japanese Americans. So white rural people, were afraid of natural disasters. They were afraid of fires. They were afraid of flooding, and they were afraid of the civil rights movement. They were afraid of people of color and Black communities standing up and often engaging in uprisings such as the Watts Rebellion. So 1965, the Watts Rebellion is a really important moment in this history. 1965 is the same year that the Sierra Conservation Center was built. So they happened within weeks of each other. The opening of the Sierra Conservation Center, which is a large prison-like facility that was intended to train and act as sort of a base camp for the network of conservation, the network of forestry camps across the state. And weeks later, Watts was on fire. So what we see here is really the embodiment of the uneven development of California and the environmental injustices of racial capitalism. Stepping back a little bit, what's operating here is these communities are being underdeveloped. They have inadequate fire protection. They have inadequate sewage and water. There's food insecurity. And then the responses to that, when the community stands up with the civil rights movement or with these rebellions, that produces a lot of fear in the white people, in the white communities. And this sort of like carceral punitive backlash allows the state to then extract like these community members and bring them into the white communities to engage in the environmental development of these rural white middle class communities. I hope that makes sense. So what I'm saying here is that there's a really broader story about racial capitalism and what Brandon calls the indentured servitude. I think it really relates to those environmental injustices. Yeah. So sorry, just briefly wrap up, put that back together. What's really operating here is the same thing that operating in 1851 when San Quentin was built. It's about taking these idle populations, these people who can't be incorporated into capitalism sufficiently, and using them for the natural resource development of California through indentured servitude. It's the same thing in 1851. It's the same thing as the Spanish missions, in a sense. But just one more brief point. I don't think that detracts from the dignity and the sense of citizenship that these people earn, as Brandon was describing. I don't think that means that people can't be proud of their work. What I found time and time again throughout this history is that these people who are working in the forest, who are fighting fires, they're really proud of what they're doing. So I don't want to detract from that at all, but that's that history.
Okay, it's, when you were talking about that history, I was thinking about World War II Black GIs were sent to California and Alaska because there was that great fear of the Japanese using hot air balloons to bring fire bombs over and drop them in the forest. And but they didn't know what to do with these Black GIs, so they send them to fight fires. And it's, a continuation of what's going on with Black prisoners or prisoners of color. But I understand there's a bill now, AB 2147 or something like that. Brandon, can you talk a little bit about that bill and what it means? And also, because this is like the last question, also, could you talk about what the people in the community can do to support this bill and make sure it's successful?
So I don't have all of the specifics on that one bill. Part of what our organization is heavily focused on, more or less the work instead of the policy. But I have had some time to review that one and a couple of other bills that are floating around within California. Basically, okay, so the juxta of these things, there are two main bases for the majority of these bills. One of them is trying to figure out a way that the state can acknowledge the contributions of these folks by providing sustainable or gainful employment to them. Some of these bills are around working with things like the PG&E, the utility companies, or other agencies that do similar work in the field, knowing that there is an increased need for more labor in this sector. Why don't we utilize, or let's create pathways for these folks where there were none. That was what one of the bills, or some of them. And then there's another access where there's a lot of folks. One of the challenges that we deal with coming home from fire camp is like a ceiling almost that we can get to, even if we transition over. First of all, there's only like 2 or 3 very unique pathways to transition over professionally. So a lot of these bills look to expand the pathways. Conversations around licensing with EMTs, conversations about criminal background checks with some of these other agencies, like I mentioned, municipalities and county fire departments, right? How do we fair hiring practices? So those are what these bills are mainly talking about. What I would say when it comes what people can do, number one, I would say is advocate to change the public perception. One of the things that I often say is being a firefighter is the most respected career in the country, period. I don't care where you come from. Everybody adores the firefighter who gets the kitty cat out the tree, right? There's not a lot of hatred for firefighters out here in this position. And so when you talk about this population of folks, when you talk about folks like me, and you have challenges with me hopping into these spaces because of my background, one of the things that folks should realize is that these folks, that myself and others in fire camp, are already in these same positions right now supporting you. And you may think, to put it blatantly, like that the fact that I'm incarcerated may give you a safety net, but like I'm doing the same work as everybody else. I'm cutting line to protect your house. Some instances I may be going in your house. Some instances I'm helping out. I'm in the community every day, already helping out. So we deserve those opportunities. Change the public perception. And also, if we can fight for laws that remove licensing challenges for folks who are trying to hop into the sector, and because there are EMT and bonding issues, and also talk to your local fire departments or agencies and check in and see what their hiring practice is, because there may be some leeway for these folks to start putting folks into these positions.
So thank you for that, Brandon. Thanks for joining me. Augustine, thanks for joining me for those updates and that overview. And we'll keep an eye on what happens in California with the firefighters in these camps.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.